Are you ready?
Activate.
Sequence start 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Shadows in the Dark. Well, we are glad that you have joined us tonight. Of course, I am your host, Jeremiah Greer, and we've got a little bit of some sad news I wanted to start off with. I don't know if many of y'all have heard of this person I'm about to tell you about, or had the opportunity to see him at a conference, but I hate to say that Chad Alston had passed away this past Sunday, unexpectedly in his sleep. I met Chad at a conference at the one up at Green Park Inn. A great guy. We had a blast together. Then again, spoke with him at another conference at the Lake Lore Inn, and he was set to speak. Honestly, we were actually scheduled to speak at a few more conferences as well. And if you listen to the 24-hour broadcast, he was our first full guest at the 1 o'clock in the morning hour during that show. And many are definitely saying sad news in the chat room. Yes, it was. Chad was a great guy. And, he had contacted me a couple weeks ago saying that he was ready to come back on the show. He had some health problems, and he was past that. He was on his A game and really wanted to come back on Shadows in the Dark because he enjoyed it. And I replied back to him and didn't hear anything. And so that's when I got the word just a few days ago that he had passed away in his sleep this Sunday. So I had a lot of respect for Chad. He'd done a lot of great work on EVP research. Great guy, smart guy. So I do want to take just a moment of silence for Chad, and please send all your thoughts and prayers, whatever you do, meditation, whatever, to his family. He does leave behind a wife and 2 kids. He was very young. So please, let's just a moment of silence. Well, I had some news stories here ready to go, and I don't know. And with this that just happened, it makes you think about things, and a lot of us are into many things. Deal with the paranormal, and I know we have a lot of ghost hunters that listen to the show, and I think sometimes, especially those who do ghost hunting, we kind of get desensitized to death, and we really then realize when someone close to us passes away. Now, I can say I was extremely close to Chad, but we definitely hit it off, and I'm going to kick away the news stories tonight. Let's just mix it up a little bit, and just I think it's important that we discuss some of this stuff. And excuse me, because I know, a little bit emotional about it, because Chad was a good friend, but it also gets you to thinking about other things. Like I said, he was young. And he left behind a wife, 2 children. Many of us out there listening to the show, married, have kids, boyfriends, girlfriends. And I guess, I'm going to get a little emotional with you here for just a moment. And maybe this is unlike Shadows in the Dark, but it's important. If you're around your loved one right now, just turn around and look at them. Let them know that you love them. Let them know how important they are to you. And just imagine them not in your life. How hard would that be? How hard would that be for your children? And, don't take those things for granted. Because family, friends are very important. And I apologize, because it's, thinking about this stuff is rough. It is emotional for me. As well as, maybe some of y'all out there, maybe you have went through this recently. And if you have, I really want you to know that I'm there for you. But, like I said, it's important that we remember what family and friends truly mean, how important they are to us, what it would be like without them in our life. And I'm not trying to make this all gloomy, but when you think about it, it comes unexpectedly sometimes. I'm young, and the last thing I would want to see is something happen to me for my family or vice versa. So I'm sorry. I really apologize. And again, I know this is unlike Shadows in the Dark. I know this is not something we normally do. But I do feel it's important. So we'll take a break, and we're going to have a great show tonight. Our guest is going to be Douglas Dietrich, and we're going to be talking about we're going to be talking about vampires. I'm going to try to collect myself a little bit here. But again, send your thoughts and prayers to Chad's family.
Visit www.shadowsinthedarkradio.com today to sign up for our free newsletter, join as a member of our forum, or browse our online store where you can find books, CDs, and DVDs, like a signed copy of The President's Vampire by Robert Damon Schneck, or the complete works of Dr. Gary Frick for only $20. That's 4 books signed by Dr. Frick that carry a great message. You will also find downloadable products like Mysteries Magazine and the Donald Kehoe interviews, DVDs featuring Charlie Carlson and Mr. Lobo. So go to www.shadowsinthedarkradio.com today and be a part of the show.
While working for 10 years as a Department of Defense research librarian, Douglas Dietrich's major duties was document destruction. During this time, he came upon some very unusual information in the files that were due to be destroyed. Douglas, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you having me here with your audience, Mr. Greer, and best wishes to him as we head into the Halloween season.
Yes, Halloween is just around the corner, isn't it?
Yeah, all too soon. Time passes all too quickly. So in terms of the subject tonight of vampires, would you like me to just get started into the material, sir, by kind of setting up the materials, why they were available, and what was going on with that situation?
Yeah, I definitely want you to tell us about this time working for the Department of Defense Research as a librarian. And I mean, because this is a very interesting story. You had the opportunity to see documents before they were destroyed, and from my understanding, some very, very interesting information passed through your hands.
That's right, sir. And it was an opportunity that I operated with oftentimes under protest, both verbally and in writing, because it needs to be emphasized that I never had a security clearance of any high-level merit. I had the most basic, fundamental level of security clearance that any military dependent would have to enter or exit a military base. I had been hired on as a librarian's aide and ultimately graduated to the post of a military reference technician. This, however, is a civilian position. It was with the Department of Defense as a postal librarian that was on a military base, in this case the Presidio military base of San Francisco. The Presidio military base is a very old military base, very politically important, and was ultimately closed in the 1990s due to an enormous number of scandals that perhaps we can cover in future shows. But the most important thing about it was that because it was so political, many politically oriented generals, and most generals, as people understand, are politicians in uniform, would request documents that would be unusual in order to do their own researches or investigations. Many of the generals on site had occult proclivities that they were pursuing. But in this case, it was a case of documents in particular, in terms of the vampire documents that I dealt with, where something was left over essentially from the 1970s. I began work at the Presidio in the 1980s. And what happens, as always, is a lot of the people who were at higher levels of responsibility with higher levels of security clearance were very lazy, very incompetent, very corrupt. They didn't want to work with the incinerator because it was dangerous. It had an evil reputation. A man had 90% of his body burned because he was saturated in alcohol when he had started working with it once in the 1970s, and after that no one touched the incinerator again. So a lot of documents were backed up for a very long time until I was employed. So one of these documents was a particular set of documents that had been declassified in the 1970s. They were a series of notes taken by a Soviet medical student at the University of Kiev. And the Soviet medical student in this series of lectures by Professor Fyodor Andreev was taking down notes concerning the utilization, the recruitment, the utilization, and ultimately breeding programs for vampires in the Soviet Union. And there was a very long series of physiological analyses of the vampires and how they could be made as partners in the march towards socialist progress in military and intelligence positions. This student later was so alarmed by this series of lectures with which he was attending that he had passed his notes on to a journalist in Czechoslovakia behind the Iron Curtain. They were in turn given to a CIA station officer in Prague, and ultimately were sent to Washington, D.C. to be translated. And the CIA immediately dismissed them as a disinformatia campaign. The Russians would often run campaigns of disinformation to misallocate American resources and intelligence. And so that conclusion was drawn about this particular series of notes. And they were given to NATO, ultimately passed on to the Army Command, and whatever duplicate or triplicate copies were made of them wound up at the Presidio military base of San Francisco, which was the Western Defense Command headquarters. And when they were declassified, just lay around in boxes until I got around to destroying them. But I took down as many notes as I could concerning these lectures and then committed them to the flames. But certainly, does that kind of outline the story behind them in general as to how they got into my hands, sir? Or
yeah, for sure. But I do want to ask, a couple of things in regards to that. Is why would they allow civilians to handle such documents? I mean, that is definitely. I know you talk about the incinerator, people afraid of it, but still, I mean, some of the things. I mean, you've told me more because we've spoke before this show many times, and you've told me how many of the documents that cross through your hands, and they are just it's amazing. And how did you get away with taking notes on them?
Because again, this has to do with the incredible corruption, laziness, incompetence of the people in charge. Some people had political positions, or the individual who was running the library literally was a lady who could not read nor write. She was functionally illiterate. She had actually gotten the promotion to get her out of the morale department of the Presidio military base because morale was rock bottom low. The Presidio military base was seething with drug abuse, child abuse, cultic activity. Since she had done nothing in her position as a morale officer, they figured, let's get rid of her by putting her into records and research. So she can't read or write, she won't know what she's looking at, so she won't do any damage. And in that case, they were absolutely correct. In terms of getting anything done, everything was left to the subordinates. Many of the older people who were working there, and it must be emphasized, they were all civilians, because this was the Department of Defense. It wasn't like they had soldiers or people of military commission who were operating the library. So the Postal Library was a Department of Defense affair, and the DoD is indeed civilian. It was, however, to be utilized by those of military rank and those of military commission, or also non-commissioned and enlisted, and of course it was. It was available to all on base in that respect. But in terms of my handling it, it was pretty much because I was at the bottom of the ladder and they counted on me to do the dirty work. So again, these documents were indeed explosive. Many of them had been declassified. Again, it needs to be emphasized, I could not take them bodily off of the federal base because they were still federal property. And had I tried to smuggle the notes out, if I had ever had the intention of doing so, I would have been arrested. That would have been serious jail time. So in terms of taking notes, I had to do that because they would actually keep careful track of how many times the photocopy machines were used, literally kept track of the toner levels on the photocopy machines in those days. There were also, in those days, a dead-end technology that we know as microfiche, which no one uses anymore. Various little things like that, which would actually require a specialist to make copies of, and something I was not trained in. So this is how they justified their jobs. For instance, certain military reference technicians there knew only how to make copies of the microfiche. Certain people were simply there to operate the projector, which I was not qualified to do. There were certain specialties that they had so that they would be called upon to operate in their technical area 1 or 2 times a day at the most. But the rest of the day was literally, I'm sad to say, unfortunately, for a lot of them, just spent drinking, or for many of them, just spent whiling the time away doing nothing. And so that's how I wound up dealing with so many of these documents. And again, I need to stress, I did this under protest. And my taking notes was ultimately, I must admit, a form of private interest and ultimately a form of vindictiveness, so that I would not forget a lot of what I was looking at, because I was destroying history. And unfortunately, I could do nothing about the photographic materials. But in terms of documentation, it was certainly serious to me to make sure that history was not lost.
Mm-hmm. Now, when especially in terms of what we're going to discuss tonight, which is the documents on vampires and what was in these documents, when you seen these, what kind of reaction did you have? I mean, this had to be something that made you step back and rethink things.
Oh, absolutely. Believe me, the entire existence that I had professionally at the Presidio military base constantly made me realize that the reality that most people live in is paper thin in terms of its consistency. One of the individuals who certainly worked on base was a Defense Intelligence Agency colonel. He retired as a colonel. At that time, he was a lieutenant colonel by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. And he was right outside of the Presidio military base. Outside the Arguello Gate was the estate of Anton LaVey, the father of the Church of Satan, the founder of the Church of Satan. Michael Aquino had been one of his followers who broke off schismatically because he took the church much more seriously than Mr. LaVey did. So he would actually perform rituals within the library while I was destroying documents at night, because he felt that that was conducive to the satanic elements, because I was destroying truth, and Satan is the father of lies. So I was witness to many of those rituals on base, and that is certainly something that makes you realize that the reality you're witnessing is nothing like the reality that most people live in. And it certainly made me realize that what I'm looking at, amongst many other things that I've experienced in life, made me realize that there might be something to what I was seeing. So certainly, with your permission, I'll start talking about the documents themselves.
Yeah, let's definitely hear about it, because this is going to be fascinating. You have kind of briefed me on it, and it's amazing what you saw in these documents and the reality behind them.
Right. No, I really appreciate that, and certainly it is. It needs to be emphasized that Dr. Fyodor Andreev was, in terms of this series of lectures, emphasizing the fact that shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, at the time of which the Russians and the Germans had reached a trade agreement and a non-aggression pact. This was in 1939, August of 1939. The Soviet Union and the Germans were strong allies. And what happened was something very similar to what we have today in terms of the German situation. Germany is a very small nation. It's much smaller than the state of Texas. There is no real room for massive training maneuvers. So one of the aspects of the non-aggression pact was to allow German units to train their units for mass maneuver warfare within Russia. And today, German units and sometimes Swiss units or small European nations actually come to the United States to train as NATO allies. So the United States has enough space for them to train mass maneuver warfare in, but there's no space back in Europe. It's simply too small in the central heart of Europe for such levels of operational training. So it was during that period of time, while the Russians were taking advantage of this situation to try to expand westward, the Germans were taking advantage of the situation to get Russian resources, that some Russian soldiers, about 4 of them, spotted a medical orderly who was attacking a young lady, and they jumped him, and he threw them off like so many matchsticks, and apparently vanished right before their eyes, or moved so quickly as to give the impression of vanishing into thin air. And two of the Russian soldiers recognized his face, and two of them ID'd his medical orderly insignia. Now, the nurse who he attacked was brought into the nearest dispensary. She appeared to be in a trance-like state from which she reemerged very shortly. She had lost about a pint of blood, but there was no blood left on her uniform or any of her clothing, so the blood that had been drained had obviously not been spilled. She had a small incision in her neck, and this is important because it was emphasized that we're not talking about bites or fangs. It was drained, however, no doubt sucked out. So what happened was the Soviets had, in that area, decided that because of the strength of this individual, they were going to lure him in to a building where they could interrogate him. So the platoon sergeant told this man the next day, and this was during daytime, that he was being considered for promotion and that he would need to be brought into a certain building for a series of interviews. When he was lured into this trap, he was told that the building was surrounded. He was on an upper story. There were guards on every floor. There were guards outside. And he was told that if he did not expose himself for what was the source of his superhuman strength, he would be killed. And it was during that series of interrogations he broke down. He said he needed blood to survive. He needed blood simply to live. And this has been the way he had been born, the way he had lived all of his life. And so he was sent to the Leningrad Psychiatric Institute for a year of study. During that year, in 1940, the Soviets were in an arms race with Germany during their period of technology exchange. And it was during that time that the Soviets began to consider this man's series of tests that he was undergoing in the Leningrad Psychiatric Institute to prove him out to be someone who was not human. And they felt that he was a member of a subspecies, a mutation of genus Homo sapiens, and that perhaps such minority groups were being mobilized by the Germans. He had an extreme sensitivity to sunlight. What the Russians were noticing was that there were select groups of German units that the Germans referred to as Nachttruppen, or Nichtsoldaten, night soldiers, who all wore hooded cloaks and gloves to protect themselves from the sunlight in the daytime, but specialized in night operations. That certain planes within the German Warsaw Pact, and there was a Warsaw Pact before the Communist bloc. The Germans had organized a German-dominated exchange rate system with Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, various other Balkan states. So certain units from these nations, certain German units, had planes that had black-tinted cockpits as if to protect them from the sunlight. Certain tanks had no cupolas or no vision ports, but rather had periscope sights. These were not innovations in any modernized sense. These were like adaptations for certain units that had a direct aversion to sunlight. This is what made the Russians take so seriously what the man was saying and give him over to the military for specialized training, and they began a program of recruiting others. I hope that I'm making myself clear with all of that.
Yeah, and now I've got a question from the chat room. Someone wanting to know, did they know or estimate what the age of this one particular person, this vampire that they trapped?
Yeah, this is important to emphasize, is the fact that vampires they usually have an indefinable air of agelessness about them. It's been concluded within the series of medical lectures that I destroyed that vampires basically have 2 to 3 times the lifespan of the average human being. And this is where we get into the medical aspects of it. Now, I am someone who has for many years attended a series of ongoing lectures in training for medical journalists at the university, UCSF, the University of California in San Francisco, in order to better advocate for my parents' care provisions while my father was still alive. So if I do get technical, don't be afraid to shut me down and bring me back to Earth. But to kind of put this from an evolutionary perspective, which was very important to the Soviets' paradigm, because they were an atheistic evolutionary state. They felt that this subspecies of genus Homo was nothing unusual considering Darwin's finches, and their belief in the evolution as opposed to creationist system led them to conclude that humans would be subject to the same evolutionary dynamics as certain lower animals. Now, Darwin discovered many finches in the Galapagos Islands, or rather a certain species of finch that fed off the blood of other birds. Not other finches, but larger birds such as albatrosses, Also, cadaver maggots. The forensic pathologists who study cadavers in the field will often find maggots flowing over corpses in such thick swarms that they're like miniature ecosystems. And within these miniature ecosystems of maggots, there will always be a very small percentage of maggots that feed off absolutely nothing but the blood of other maggots. Within axolotls, which is a form of salamander, when there's overpopulation in the tank, at some point a trigger will occur in a recessive gene in one of them where it will start to cannibalize the others. So if we are to accept the evolutionary paradigm the way the Soviets did, the belief was already extant that human beings were primates who had lost the battle of the planet of the apes a long time ago. In other words, the apes that stayed in the trees won the war, and those that were kicked out of the trees basically had to learn to stand on two legs so they could see the animals charging at them to eat them. So the Soviets had this kind of perspective that was already extremely pragmatic in their regard. Now, as for the reason for that battle of the planet of the apes, the Soviets had concluded that at some point some mother ape, some mother primate had given birth to a monster. In other words, an ape that ate meat, or a monkey that ate meat, something with a taste for blood. And that is what we are considered within the Soviet paradigm. Humanity is simply an omnivorous ape. Not a predatory or carnivorous ape, but an omnivorous ape, one that eats anything, and therefore vampires would simply be a specialized subspeciation. And but all predators, and this is what a vampire would be, a combination of a parasite and a predator, all predators are extremely fragile, such as sharks. It's impossible to breed them in captivity or to even keep them alive in aquariums. It's been the holy grail of aquariums for quite some time. But so it is with a vampire. They have enormous strength. They have enormous advantages in terms of reflexes, bone mass. But however, they are extremely fragile in many other ways, such as photosensitivity and other things that all start going into in terms of their physiology. But in terms of the history, do you feel that I've covered that satisfactorily in terms of the background to the series of medical investigations that were begun on identifying vampires?
Yeah, and now I want to ask, you mentioned about the salamanders, and in a closed area that once overpopulation begins, that there's something that triggers and they kind of start cannibalizing each other. And I'm curious, did you see anything or come across theories that maybe that these vampires were kind of what was maybe happening with us? I mean, we've heard overpopulation of the Earth as a huge problem for years and only getting worse.
It's an excellent question because that's certainly something that struck my mind, but then again it was concluded that they had been around for millennia, that this is something that's always been around. Now that recessive gene has always been in salamanders, specifically the axolotl species of salamander, and when they are overpopulated, more specifically one of them will be triggered in terms of that recessive gene. It won't be a mass triggering. One of them will have that recessive gene triggered, and it will start eating the rest. That only happens with one of them. So this is how limited that kind of triggering is, and it goes into kind of the evolutionary perspective, which I'm not necessarily advocating, but I'm presenting this atheistic state system that the Soviets held as their paradigm. So that was their interpretation of this phenomena. Now, we have to remember that these documents were written prior to the discovery of DNA. We're talking about 1969 through 1970. These series of lectures were delivered. So genes were known about. They were referred to in terms of eugenics, such as breeding programs. Dysgenics would mean breeding down. The Soviets used terms like that just as well as the Nazis did, because they were trying to create a Homo Sovieticus. But within that context, since this was a series of medical lectures as opposed to a series of lectures in macroevolution, they mostly approached the vampire as someone who was suffering from like a form of leukemia or an anemia type of analogy. As an example, what the body needs will always taste good. When Europeans suffered from massive American bombardment during the Second World War, and when were unable to get any proper diet into their system, many Europeans would take cod liver oil and spread it on their toast like it was peanut butter or jelly and just eat that with delight because their bodies were so impacted by starvation and malnutrition. After the war, these same individuals, you couldn't pay them to put cod liver oil on their toast or on their bread. But if your body needs it, it will taste good. And so that was the kind of analogy that was presented in terms of the vampires. It was certainly interpreted as something that would be passed on through genes. If we were to see the same type of study done today on vampires, then we would probably get a much more genetically modernized interpretation. I hope that sounds coherent.
Yeah, and now I've got a couple questions coming from the chat room that I want to make sure we get in, and this seems to be, specifically towards the vampire that was captured and interviewed, tested, and we have one question coming from Peace River wanting to know what if anything was stated as what exactly happened to him. Did they let him go? Did they keep him?
Excellent point. Because all of these lectures had question and answer sections at the end, and there were questions from the students as to what happened to that particular vampire. And Dr. Fyodor Andreev said that for reasons of state security, nothing more could be stated other than that man was considered their version of patient zero in terms of establishing physical evidence of a vampire mutation, that he was given special military training. This was before the German invasion of Russia. He was considered to be the first in a series of recruitment that was to begin immediately because, as I said, they were afraid the Germans were mobilizing vampire minority populations for military exploitation. And so in that regard, he disappears into history. But other students presented rumors they had heard. Students presented rumors to the Professor Andreev to see if he could confirm them. They said, my father was in the Stavka, the shock front that entered Berlin at the end of the war. They said that there were blood drinkers amongst certain units of the Red Army that were turned loose in Berlin at the end of the war that fed on anything that was hiding in the cellars, old women, children, anything they could find. They would attack them and drain them, and that this was considered madness when they would complain to their higher officers about this form of blood madness or war berserkery that was frightening them. They did not want to work with these individuals, and they were asking if this man had been one of the patient zero father line, so to speak, of this kind of phenomena. And Dr. Fyodor Andreev would always turn such questions aside and say, no, he was not, this is not something to go into. This is beyond the purpose of these lectures. We are going to stick specifically with medical issues. And other questions, for example, before they were turned away, was one of them had heard the rumor that this patient zero was sent as an assassin into Berlin to assassinate Adolf Hitler in the Fuhrer bunker towards the end of the war. With all of the special training he had received, he had obviously been the most indoctrinated and trained of all of the vampires to be recruited from later during the war, and that the recruitment program itself suffered during the war simply because of the war itself. That it was never the mobilized effort that they had wanted because of the war's interference with it, and it was only after the war that they established the colony, which, with your permission, I'll turn toward the colony now as an example of how they began to study the vampires. I did mention this to you before, yes?
Yeah, and now will we be getting into what kind of tests were done? Because that was another question I had from the chat room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the tests that were done, I will certainly go into that. Yes. They were mostly performed at the colony in Novaya Zemlya. Where what happens is there is basically an island or a series of islands that are north of Russia, north of European Russia, that go towards the Arctic Circle that are known as Novaya Zemlya. And if you look these up on your maps, you will find that it is night there 6 months out of the year, which was extremely important because of the photosensitivity of the vampires. So they would establish as many people they could identify, and I will go into the identification process in a moment, on that island in an attempt to further test them, in an attempt to further breed them. The Dr. Andreev did not specifically talk about the tests applied to this individual, but I'm certain it's the same amount of tests or the same type of testing that was done with many of his vampiric kin on that island at a later point, which these chronicles did go into. Because Dr. Andreev was talking about a contemporary program in the 60s and the 70s, and the historical background was more of a reference to basically give a medical history as to why the program was justified. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, great, great. So what had happened on the island was that when the colony was established, cameras were set up everywhere, and the attempt was to breed vampires. The attempt was to bring many, many political dissidents up onto the colony for the vampires to feed off of, and they were just thrown to the vampires as food. And all of the vampires were allowed to drain their blood and take what they needed. But in terms of the way it was interpreted, in terms of what the Russians saw, I will begin at this point to describe that. First off, it needs to be emphasized that the vampire is essentially identical to the normal human being, but his body temperature is considerably lower, varying from 28 degrees to 30 degrees Celsius. And I have never bothered to interpret that into Fahrenheit, so I'm not quite sure how low that is in terms of numbers we're more familiar with, but I'm sure it's quite low. And their respiration and their pulse are far lower, and therefore their overall metabolism is much slower, which sounds counterintuitive to how fast that they can move. But it certainly would explain their longevity. Depending on the nourishment they receive, the individual would be active or lethargic to a greater or lesser degree. And the myths that hold about the camel hump essentially hold true with the vampire. In other words, we have a myth that the camel's hump holds water, which enables it to traverse the desert. In reality, the camel's hump holds fat, and this enables it to keep warm during the intensely cold desert nights, and it also enables it to feed for long periods of time off of the fat within the hump itself, so that it can go without food for long periods of time. But the reason the camel drinks like a camel is because it needs to stoke up for long trips through the desert. But with the vampire, the myth of the liquid reservoir holds true. Their stomach apparently acts as a reservoir by means of a valve in the duodenum, which acted as a regulator. A steady supply of blood would go through the intestinal tract and be absorbed into the body. And if the individual's intake was sufficient enough to fill the stomach capacity, it could go without taking nourishment, the vampire, for as long as 5 days. And so it's important to realize also that like other predators, it had incredible advantages. Just as zoologically, it's a zoological fact that sharks swim through toxic waters, polluted waters. They eat a lot of rotten carrion and meat. They eat incredibly toxic things like everything from tires to hypodermic needles. But the amazing thing is that sharks do not get cancer. So for many years, Cuba produced shark cartilage pills, which were later on sold on the American market, mostly through Canada. So that was apparently a very exciting characteristic about the vampire's body, was that it also possessed anti-carcinogenic factors in its bloodstream or its cells, where they never seemed to suffer cancer. So the vampire's blood was often the Soviets tried to transfuse this into cancer patients, but with no effect in terms of any success. But we'll probably need to cover how they were identified in the first place in order to be taken into the colony. And with your permission, I'll start on that. Are there any other questions from the chat room or that are coming in?
There is kind of a clarification as to now the documents that you've seen. What time period were they from? I know you were looking at these. Would you say, or were the documents from around the late '60s, early '70s?
The documents were from 1969 through 1970.
Okay, that's what I thought you had said.
Yeah, and so basically when I was dealing with them was in the mid-1980s. That's when I was consigning them to the flames. But in terms of what the Soviets were dealing with, again, because of the uniqueness of the source, that accounts for an extremely, shall I say, telescoped perspective. There's no point in even going into all of the medical detail, which was extremely turgid, simply because it would bore us all to tears, such as Cowper's gland secretions and various other just nuances. But the overall conclusions, to keep it in a more general sense, are fascinating. Certainly, vampires were found to have an extremely low sex drive, which makes perfect sense because how many people do you know that would play with their food on a sexual level? And indeed, would you even want to know them if that were a fact? But since human beings are a food source for vampires, obviously they don't look on them with any sensuality. But the other interesting aspect that the Soviets interpreted evolutionarily is that there were only male vampires. They could not find a single specimen of female vampire. Of course, we could always draw the conclusion that the women were always smarter and avoided capture. Are being signaled out, or conceivably they smelled better, and that's one of the keys of identification. The vampires, like pigs, do not sweat. This is an important thing in Semitic culture that basically manifests because of that physical fact. It's a zoological fact that pigs do not sweat. Therefore, in colder climes, such as in Germany, Northern Europe, America, pigs can be kept quite handily without doing too much damage to the local economy. But in the Arab or Jewish cultures of the desert from many years ago, if anybody kept pigs, he was one decadent SOB. We're talking about kings of the pagan days would keep huge flocks of pigs, and because they didn't sweat, you would have to literally spray them with buckets of water to keep them alive in the desert, and you're depriving entire villages and families of water when you're doing this. This is one reason why pigs were always looked down upon as a food source in Islam and in Judaism. But vampires are not desert dwellers. They are very much like pigs in the sense they do not sweat. Rather, they secrete an extremely malodorous substance that smells like a rotten cadaver. And this is how they locate each other. I wouldn't say that it's so much a turn-on, like a mating a sense, or some kind of musk, but rather that it is how predators like wolves, lone wolves prowling vast amounts of territory, will identify each other so that one who is the senior in the territory can hunt the other one out and identify him and tell him essentially that this territory is mine and you'll have to find your prey someplace else. That is what was concluded by the Soviets. Now one might ask, well, how did they live for millennia with this incredibly malodorous kind of curse? And the reason is quite simple. The European hygiene never knew the influx of bathing until the Europeans began to colonize the Orient. As a matter of fact, British used to call bathing the China habit. It was believed by Europeans and Americans that bathing, especially in hot water, would make you deathly ill. And so in all of Europe for hundreds of years, literally until the 19th century, Europeans did not bathe, and they would eat basically rotten meat. This is why they had such a need for spices from the Orient. This is why mustard was developed, was to cover up the taste of rancid meat. Europeans would basically keep meat in their larders for what we would consider an inordinate amount of time for unrefrigerated food. It would often be crawling with maggots. They would consider that tenderized or soft, and they would hide the taste of rancidity with mustards that they developed and also spices from the Orient. Now, in that kind of environment where you're eating food like that, and the only way to cover up your body odor is through perfumes, this is before the invention of deodorants, certainly those colognes would also be exploited by vampires, and they would pass by through crowds, I am certain, unnoticed to anyone other than themselves. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, great. And so what happens is that kind of explains their ability to coexist with humanity for such a long period of time. Certainly another aspect of them medically that was emphasized was the fact that their blood was very much anticoagulant throughout the entire system. So they were all functional hemophiliacs. Unlike the human body, where our key to healing lies in the coagulation of our blood, the vampires instead would have their epidermis heal with great rapidity, meaning the skin. The skin is, of course, the body's largest organ, and being such, if in the case of the vampire, it is the cells of that thin tissue layer that covers the muscle and venous system of the body. Those cells apparently rejoin, reconnect, heal with amazing rapidity, almost in front of the eyes. And as such, the functional hemophilia of the vampire does not cause it to risk undue risk when injured. This is why people would stake the vampires. The idea was if you could drive a stake through a vampire and literally pin him to the ground with a railroad tie, so to speak, no matter what material that stake was made of, then his skin, his epidermis, would not be able to close the wound, and because he's a functional hemophiliac, he would bleed out profusely within moments. So that was the logic behind that. And one might ask, well, why would they be like this? It seems like such a disadvantage, but this is what leeches do. Leeches basically, as blood-sucking parasites, will clamp onto somebody, and they will secrete an anticoagulant in their saliva into that person's blood, so the person's blood does not coagulate. Otherwise, it would be too thick for the leech to suck. So the leech secretes an anticoagulant that keeps the blood thin throughout the time the leech is sucking, so it can bloat itself. And hopefully, I believe that certainly people in your audience understand what I'm talking about. I don't believe that that's too out there for them. But in terms of the genetics that I was speaking of, the Soviets concluded that the reason there were no female vampires were simply because they lacked the upper body strength, or the strength in general, to hold a struggling person down. And that seems to make eminent evolutionary sense. You have basically a gene line that's passed down exclusively through the male gender. It is a predatory parasite that essentially will reproduce only by either some kind of relationship, which I would presume to be very lacking in empathy. I would conclude it would be rape, through which they would reproduce maybe once in 100 years. And the child who would be born, depending on the dominant genes of the woman who was attacked, would either be a vampire or it would not be. But if it were a vampire, it most definitely would be male. This was the conclusions that they drew. Does that sound like it makes sense, or?
Yeah,
okay,
definitely.
Great. I mean, another reason why they concluded there were no female vampires was the lack of brittleness in vampire bones, which permitted them to fall or leap from great heights without any particular danger. And females, of course, have a skeleton that needs to plasticize with pregnancies. In other words, when a woman is pregnant, her bones literally kind of become very pliable, so that she's able to ultimately deliver the baby. And in that respect, this is one reason why women have such calcium issues as they continue to age, as opposed to, in proportion, the kind of calcium issues a man may suffer from. And which would be another reason why vampires, it wouldn't make sense for a female vampire evolutionary wise, simply because of the need for such a incredibly massive bone structure that most vampires had. And so, again, their superior agility, their incredible strength, their eyesight was remarkable. No vampire that had submitted to physical examination proved to have a visual acuity of less than 20/20, and their ability to see in near absolute darkness led to comparisons with electronic light image amplifiers. But at the same time, the weaknesses that compensated for that would be the fact that they would be so photosensitive that any exposure to sunlight would cause extreme pain in terms of their eyesight. In terms of their extreme ocular photosensitivity would literally cause their eyes to become so bloodshot and subject to pain that if the exposure continued, that they would actually bleed profusely from their eye sockets. So before the development of tinted lenses and ultimately sunglasses in the more modern age, vampires rarely would venture into daylight. Also, it would increase painful burning sensations all over their skin. They wouldn't turn to dust. They wouldn't burst into flames. It's simply that it would accelerate their metabolic activity, which for them, what would be to such a degree of rapidity that whatever blood they had stored in their stomach would drain into the small intestine and create excruciating abdominal pain. And the combination of the skin discomfort, the photosensitivity, the abdominal pain would cause such agony that the vampires would go berserk, at which time they would become extremely dangerous to everyone around them and themselves. So they preferred to sleep because of their metabolism in extremely cold, dark places, and their metabolism would slow down even more, depending on the temperature, to such a degree that they would assume a death-like appearance and be presumed to be corpses by vampire hunters back in the more classic days. And as a matter of fact, the conditions would be so deceptive that if this temperature were low enough, that the respiration rate would drop radically to the point where there would be no signs of life for anyone other than a medical doctor to detect. And depending on how recently the vampire took nourishment, perhaps the only thing that would betray him would be a ruddiness in complexion. Otherwise, the complexion of the vampire would be normally pale, but his body structure would be slender, well-proportioned, totally lacking in fatty tissue. Another reason why the Soviets concluded there was no evolutionary reason for a female vampire is because women, of course, need enough fatty padding for the birthing process. They need fat not only for themselves, but for whatever child that they may carry. And again, this is the kind of logic that was applied by a pragmatic, atheistic state paradigm. But I'm certain that there must be other questions coming up right now that there must be some things that are escaping my memory. If you could bring them up for what we discussed last time, for instance.
Well, I tell you what we're going to do, Douglas. I do have some questions jotted down, but we're going to go to the break first.
Fabulous.
Because it is about that time, and when we come back, I will definitely get to the questions. I know you also wanted to talk about what exactly was, I think we kind of got a little sidetracked, but what was going on in the colonies that were put together, as well as, I want to discuss what was in the documents compared to, the known vampire myths and lore.
Absolutely.
And where that I know we've already discussed them here and there, but really kind of all in one piece. So we'll do that. So everybody, we'll be back in a moment with our guest talking more about vampires, and that is Douglas Dietrich. You are listening to Shadows in the Dark, broadcasting live at shadowsinthedarkradio.com and Dark Plains Radio at darkplainsradio.com. The show can also be heard as a rebroadcast at ParaX at para-x.com and available as a podcast at Black Vault Radio at blackvaultradio.com and Planet Paranormal at planetparanormal.com.
Have you been wondering what gift to get that special person in your life? Then you need to visit Mountain View Candleworks, your one-stop headquarters for candles, fountains, specialty foods, and much more. Just visit www.mountainviewcandleworks.com. We make your candles with mountain care.
More than just another New Age journal, Mysteries Magazine provides a thought-provoking, in-depth look into myths, magic, and the paranormal, as well as the mysteries which have intrigued both historians and scientists from the beginning of time. So subscribe today by visiting www.mysteriesmagazine.com or pick up a copy at select newsstands throughout the U.S. and Canada. Again, that was www.mysteriesmagazine.com. Challenge your beliefs.
Are you wondering if the path that you've chosen is the right one for you? Or would you like to see a glimpse of what the future may hold? Tarot may be able to help you understand better the path that you're on. The cards don't lie, nor do they lead you astray, as they're a vehicle for messages from God, angels, and guides. Have your cards read for you by world-renowned tarot card master Scotty Roberts. To schedule a private reading with Scotty, visit www.tarotbyscotty.com today and find out what the cards may hold for you.
Hello everybody, this is Mr. G from the World Paranormal Society and from Haunt the Hunters on DarkPlainsRadio.com. I would like to tell you about a website. It's called TreasureForAllUSA.com, where I got everything from knickknacks to complete DVR systems. A place where you can shop for everything and everything, and if we don't have it, I'll find it for you. That's again, TreasureForAllUSA.com, everything from DVR systems, TV sets, knickknacks, and gifts for loved ones. Come check it out, TreasureForAllUSA.com. You won't be disappointed.
All right, tonight we are talking with Douglas Dietrich, and we are speaking about vampires and the documents that passed through his hands that were due to be destroyed, that were declassified government documents that talked about the studies of vampires. Very, very interesting stuff. Now, Douglas, as we left there, I know you wanted to get more into exactly the vampire colonies that were put in place by the Soviets, and what exactly was going on there.
Well, again, the location was the island of Novaya Zemlya near Ruskaya Garden, especially well suited to such a program due to its cold climate and the fact that it's night 6 months out of the year, which gave the vampires full run of the place in a sense of physical comfort. However, also they were monitored literally 24 hours a day by cameras, by guards, and allowed their human prey in exchange for basically offering themselves for physical examinations, various tests. Vampires that would not cooperate, and apparently there were many of them, were killed, and they were analyzed in terms of vivisection and dissection, which allowed for such an incredibly detailed set of medical lectures to be given. At the colony, they were attempting to breed the vampires, and of course this is where it was discovered that their sex drive was so low as to be non-existent compared to a human being with his short lifetime and a human's short need to reproduce in such a short amount of life compared to that of a vampire. But while they were attempting to breed them, they found out that the vampire penis was erectile, that because of their intake and their diet, their urine was of a reddish hue, and that their semen, when ejaculated, was of a pinkish color. So these were certain unique attributes that identified a vampire, and of course, whenever they were driven to try and reproduce against their will or do anything against their will, like any human being, they would become extremely agitated, and that offensive odor that I spoke of was definitely tied up with their emotions. So they were emotional creatures, and that kind of malodorous secretion would increase as much as 100% when they were agitated, angry, frightened, or in the rare case, physically aroused. But the government took it in its own hands to try and do something that they believed had never been developed in nature, which was to create female vampires for use in intelligence. And so they had to satisfy themselves with modern blood transfusion methods in that regard. And these documents were written at that time that process was ongoing, and the attempts to create vaccinations against vampire infection. And this is important to emphasize. Again, these are the days before DNA, so the entire phenomenon of vampirism was isolated in Soviet eyes to what was known as a viroid organism. So they felt that the vampires had a genetic ability or inherent mutation, but at the same time that there must be a viroid organism that could be transferred to other peoples that could turn them. So they tried to develop vaccinations against vampirism and also an ability to turn people into vampires, specifically females, for their own exploitation. And they felt that this could be done and that the process took about a year. So they must have had some results that they felt were in some way or another successful. In other words, some woman must have taken, but as to whether they survived or whether they lived, since that was such a new phenomena to walk the earth, the female vampire, at the time that those documents were written and turned over by the medical student to the Czech journalist, nothing was known to me about the results. Nothing was known to me about the ultimate fate of the colony after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the best I can do is segue us into the historical aspects of vampire lore in Eastern Europe that have been around for thousands of years from this point with what was mentioned in the documents, and that was the vampires' hypersensitivity to aromatic herbs. It was found that the thoughts that they were unable to tolerate the garlic, leeks, onions, was found to be true. That because of their extreme olfactory hypersensitivity, for some reason the onions and the garlic or any aromatic herbs would actually create nausea, dizziness, the physical need to vomit in them because they would have such a strong reaction to it. They would tear up, so to speak, since they didn't secrete tears the way we would or sweat the way we would. They would have their version of that kind of adverse reaction on the basis of exposure to garlic or onions, which explains why people in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe have been warding them off with these aromatic herbs for thousands of years. And in terms of holy iconography or the cross, the crucifix, or any holy icon, there has never, I need to emphasize this quite strongly, been at all in European lore for thousands of years. There has never been any mention or any or any belief that they were averse to the cross or adverse to any holy iconography, and this sat quite well, of course, with the Soviet Union's atheistic state paradigm. It was something that confirmed their belief in this as an evolutionary mutation as opposed to a supernatural or religious phenomena. Indeed, to kind of explain the Balkan and specifically the Balkan, but also the Slavic belief in vampires and what their existence was all about, I'll basically segue into history, and with your permission, I'll basically start talking about my time in the Balkans and what I discovered about the historical Dracula that so many people misinterpret. Is that all right?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So during the time I spent in the Balkans in the 1990s, when I was involved in private security enforcement, I ultimately had the pride and the privilege at the height of my security career to stand guard to the Prince and Princess of Yugoslavia. That was one reason that I was able to travel to such a great extent within the Balkan region. And it needs to be emphasized, of course, that in the Balkans, the belief in vampires is quite a normal part of reality. Indeed, if someone were to speak about there not being vampires, they would be looked upon as somewhat idiotic or somewhat retarded. It would be like saying there's no such. It would be like saying the world is flat. And one of the reasons for this belief is that these are extremely religious people, and this is where things need to get emphasized. We're not talking about the Soviet state atheistic paradigm anymore of absolute materialism and an evolutionary interpretation of a medical physiology. Now we're talking about a supernatural interpretation of vampires and what they're all about. So it does need to be emphasized that the traditional belief is that a person would become a vampire if they were excommunicated, and that if a person were to become apostate and to lose his faith, he may also be damned. And it was believed that the body would lie basically inviolate for about 40 days, incorruptible. And at the end of that 40 days, depending on the person's condition in life, he would either ascend to heaven or go to hell, or in certain specific cases, such as excommunication, be condemned to wander the earth forever because the earth itself would reject the body. And this is essentially what was believed to have happened to the historical Dracula in the Serbian and Romanian regions. And it's important to emphasize again what most people are already familiar with: Vladislav Tepes, what the Americans know as Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, or Vlad Tepes. That's an anglicization, but the correct Romanian pronunciation is Zbestiu, and that simply means the Impaler. But Vlad the Impaler was, of course, a genuine historical figure. In Romania, he is believed to have become a vampire, and the reason for that was because he had served as a defender of Orthodox Byzantine Christendom for many years of his life, and what had happened was towards the end of his life, when his nation was devastated by the Turkish invasions, there was only one recourse that he really had to continue to get the finances and material support in his war efforts, his crusades against Islam that was invading his nation, and that was to convert to Catholicism, which was the faith of the Holy Roman Empire. And that was the empire which had the finances and the manpower to back him. And when he converted to Catholicism, he was condemned in the eyes of his Orthodox Byzantine Church, Romanian Orthodoxy, and declared to be excommunicated. And so it was believed that when he died, his soul would know no rest. And he is looked on as the father of modern Romania. He is looked on as a tragic hero, a hero of Homerically tragic proportions, and that he's still condemned and cursed to guard Christendom until he is relieved of his curse. And so it's important to remember that because there was never any belief that vampires had an aversion to crucifixes or any holy iconography, when people would meet Dracula on the road, it was simply known that no practicing Jew, no devout Muslim would ever make the sign of the cross. Any Romanian or any passerby who was a member of Christendom who met him would drop to their knees and hold up the sign of the crucifix or put their fingers into the sign of the cross to let him know that they were a Christian and therefore one of his subjects for protection. So it's not a ward, it's a past. And that's something that's in their culture that is never understood in modern Western paradigms because of the perversion of the Victorian Gothic, which took that belief and turned it into a cheap thrills kind of aversion to holy iconography. And in order to understand that mindset, we have to remember that at the time that Dracula was alive, and Dracula was, of course, a knighted title, he inherited the title from his father, Dracul. And Dracul simply means dragon. Dracula means son of the dragon. What had happened was the Holy Roman Emperor of the First Reich, Emperor Sigismund, had basically established an Order of the Dragon in 1408. And the Order of the Dragon was like a military order that was designed to defend the First Reich against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and a third category, supernatural. And in terms of the foreign, the Islamic invasions were an obvious example. In terms of domestic, it would be the Protestant heresies as they were interpreted by the Holy Roman Empire. And in terms of the supernatural, it was actually vampires and werewolves. So werewolves were taken to be a historical reality. Indeed, Sigismund, as the Holy Roman Emperor, he basically was fighting the Reformation. And when he called the Council of Leading Theologians to discuss the phenomena of Protestantism and other supernatural plagues on the land as he interpreted them, he got the theologians to pronounce the Church's infallible ruling on werewolves. And it was commonly assumed by everyone that werewolves were reality. And indeed, anyone who didn't believe that a human being could transform himself into a werewolf was guilty of heresy. And the standard punishment for heresy under Emperor Sigismund was burning at the stake. And it was believed that werewolves, of course, were still human, and they were alive. But because they were creatures of sin who lived off of murder during the nights of the full moon, when they died, they were damned, and they would become full-fledged vampires. So what happened was that Dracul was called to Nuremberg, the later site of the holy city of the Nazis and the Nazi rallies, to help establish the Order of the Dragon. He was sworn in as a member to fight not only Protestants and Muslims, but also werewolves, and to slay vampires that the werewolves would later become, or that the enemies of the church would become if they were apostate or excommunicated. So Dracula's father was actually a member of an order of vampire slayers, and he himself inherited that responsibility when he inherited his father's title. He inherited that crusade. And it was under those auspices, that level of responsibility, that he took the throne of Wallachia, the core of the nation of Romania, which at that time was no bigger than Connecticut, and founded it as a nation that was Orthodox and independent of the Catholic Holy Roman Empire and independent of the Muslims that were invading it. And to put this into perspective for Western listeners, the equivalent of the fall of Constantinople, which happened in Dracula's time, was the equivalent of when the Muslims took Constantinople, which was the holy seat of the Orthodox Christian religion. That was the equivalent of a modern successful Soviet invasion of Western Europe. And that's what it was like for Christendom at that point in history. It was that devastating. We have to remember there was no such thing as politics in Dracula's time. The closest thing that a man had to politics was religion. A man lived or died by not only being a Christian or a Muslim, but what kind of Christian or Muslim that he was. So if he were to become a Protestant, he was risking the threat of heresy, burning at the stake under Sigismund's First Reich. If he were to become a Muslim, You can imagine there's the differences between Shia and Sunni, which existed at that time. So men lived or died only by this totalitarian concept of their religions. And there was no such thing as Europe. The closest concept that we had to Europe at that point in history was Christendom. So when Dracula became the front-line crusader against the Muslims, he was declared by the Pope in Rome to be the athlete of Christ once he converted to Catholicism in order to get the church's manpower and financial support, but then he was damned in the eyes of his own church. And that kind of puts him in a historical perspective, which I hope has some clarity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
Oh, fabulous. It's fabulous. And in terms of, people might ask, well, why did the Byzantine Orthodox Church not cooperate with Catholicism as a church in order to bring the satellite nations of the Balkans into the ranks of the Holy Roman Empire and their protection? It was because one of the reasons why Constantinople had always maintained a separate capital from the Catholic Church was because they believed that when the Third Punic War ended with the pagan empire of Rome, that when the empire of Carthage was obliterated and 50,000 people were killed in the final siege of Carthage and the survivors were enslaved, they felt that at that time the Romans finally broke Carthaginian power with infernal aid, and they pointed to the final slaughter as what was actually an act of infernal sacrifice. So to the Orthodox Byzantine Catholic Church, Byzantine, what we would call Greek Catholic or Orthodox Byzantine Christian Church, to them, Rome was a cursed city, and that explains their aversion. I hope that puts it in a kind of theological perspective under which Dracula was operating in terms of his reality at the time, and why he would be such a lonely, tragic figure wandering Europe in Romanian mythology, protecting all of Christendom, which had essentially rejected him. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And
it definitely does.
Yeah, and so, I mean, with that in mind, I'm certainly happy to answer any other questions that your callers or yourself might have in terms of, again, a historical perspective on vampires and how that might match with some of what was mentioned in the actual medical documents that I was destroying. Certainly, I'd like to hear the audience's opinion on the CIA's conclusion that this was simply disinformation, this was all nonsense, they wouldn't entertain any of it, but the source was so singular, there was no other leak concerning this phenomenon that I have ever heard of from the Soviet Union. It doesn't make sense that a disinformation campaign would be so limited in scope.
Right, yeah, for sure. And definitely, yeah, I want to get into that, but I have quite a few questions jotted down.
Great.
And I want to make sure that we get these in. And I want to start off with we had one listener in our chat room asking about, did the documents ever indicate the number of vampires that were located, tracked, or tested?
They were certainly enough to establish what they considered to be a viable colony, but how can you establish a viable colony that is entirely male? So we're talking about something that was essentially a prison, and the number of people who were at the colony was said to number in the hundreds. For instance, when I was speaking of the select units that the Soviets were keying on as potentially vampire units or vampiric minority units that the Germans were mobilizing when they were taking a look at, for instance, black canopies on certain plane squadrons, when they were taking a look at troops that were seen in the daytime wearing only hoods, gas masks, cloaks, gloves, when they were taking a look at certain tanks that had no cupolas or vision ports but only periscopic sights. We're talking about extremely small units. It's important to remember that the average German unit was a 10-man unit. There would be a 4-man heavy machine gun section, 5 rifles, what they called a maniple, or 5 men who were riflemen, and 1 squad leader. So 45,000 such squads attacked Russia on June 22, 1941, after Hitler could no longer tolerate Russia's invasion of Finland, Russia's invasion of all of the Baltic littoral, such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Russia's invasion of Romania, in which they stole vast tracts of territory from that country. When Hitler was forced to counterattack with that invasion, he had an enormous amount of these units, but these are extremely small units. I hope that kind of clarifies how small some of these operating minorities would be. In terms of the colony itself, again, there were hundreds, and that's all that the doctor would mention because he was so tunneled in on the physiology as opposed to the functioning of the colony itself, regrettably.
Right. All right. Well, now another question that came up in the chat room was, what about today? Have you discovered anything that shows that definitely there's vampires existing today? Anything that backs up any recent material that backs up those from the documents that came across your hands?
I have seen nothing in terms of not working for the government anymore, of course. I've certainly seen nothing in terms of government documents. At the time that I was working for the government, it certainly I had an opportunity to speak to many people who had traveled many places in the world. Aside from anecdotal evidence, which I think many of us have already heard concerning vampire attacks, humans with their blood being drained, there's nothing much else that I heard. But you bring up an important point that I forgot to mention. It is important to remember that at the time that the Soviets and the Nazis were allies, it was shortly before that non-aggression pact was made that Bela Lugosi actually made the first Dracula film in cinema. And if you ever take a look at that Dracula film that Bela Lugosi is in, he does not have fangs. And there is never any exposure of his teeth as being fanged. That was a later gimmick that was dreamed up by Hollywood. And if you take a look at a certain vampire movie called The Hunger, which Whitley Strieber had a hand in writing, Whitley is a man who is incredibly acquainted with the occult phenomena, and you'll notice that the vampires in that film actually use miniature blades to cut open the throats of their victims, usually hidden in their necklaces, in an ankh or an other symbol, some other symbol of theirs that they favor. And that's how they assess the blood, is through actually incisions, not made by teeth, but by small blades that they carry, which are, to use a very grotesque example, no bigger than a paper cutter or a box cutter. In terms of, or a very small box cutter in terms of a blade. And so in the movie makes it melodramatic in The Hunger because you see blood splatter all over the place. Now, how many people dig into a tray of food and splash it everywhere all over the table when they're eating?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's obviously a vampire would be sucking on that wound before it even had a chance to coagulate or had a chance to spray out so far that he would lose an enormous amount of food, et cetera, et cetera. So you're not going to see blood wasted any more than a person is going to be tossing food out of his tray for the sake of some melodramatic effect. Nobody eats like that. So it brings up an important point that I had forgotten to mention, is that throughout the entire series of medical lectures, no fangs were ever mentioned. And I hope that makes sense in light of what I've said.
Yeah, it does. I mean, you definitely, have to take into consideration what Hollywood has done to, some of what's out there. I mean, they definitely, they've got to make it entertaining and scary.
Yeah.
Even though even though just talking about this, fangs or not, it's still scary.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly. And I think people should be more frightened by the awareness that there are creatures out there who are not so easily identifiable, because every time you smile, you show a mouthful of fangs, would certainly give anyone a
right. Yeah.
But in terms of people who would exist by living amongst us, again, you bring up a point that I need to reemphasize. When I speak about vampires venturing out in the daytime, we have to look at the normal human biorhythm. The average human being, before the invention of artificial light, lived by getting up when the sun rose and by going to bed when the sun went down. And this is how it was for millions of years for the vast majority of humanity that was not engaged in active combat, hunting, or sentry duty. So for everyone else, you slept at night when it was dark. So it makes perfect sense that a predator would evolve to be nocturnal, to prey upon his prey when it was in its weakest state. And it also makes sense that for us, now with the invention of artificial light, now with the conglomeration of cities, we now have 24-hour-a-day biorhythms. Our sleeping patterns are tremendously fragmented, and we suffer for it. But night is a frontier. So we now have all-night security guards. We now have all-night pizza delivery. We now have late-night radio shows. This is the same with vampires. You know, they can go out in the daylight, but it is a frontier for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. And that is probably, for some reason, a concept which a lot of people have a hard time handling, because, again, the Hollywood melodrama is, the vampire goes out and he bursts into flame.
Right,
he turns to ashes, you know, and so that's kind of what deprives us of the reality. Now, I hate to use these cinematic examples, but we have to think of, say, for instance, when Jules Verne wrote the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his hero, Captain Nemo, was an Asian Indian. And the British so hated his hero that when they translated it into English, they literally censored 25% of that book. And I have never seen it reprinted in English ever, where that 25% was ever included, which talks about Captain Nemo's Asian Indian background, his entire family being killed by the British. Now, if the authorities do this with fiction, think of what they do with fact.
Right.
So that's a point that I'm trying to point out about. Wouldn't that be, just as every Disney film showed Captain Nemo to be basically a Caucasian with no motivation based on politics, just this kind of pathological pacifism where he's hunting down warships because they're warships, as opposed to specifically British warships in the novel because his family was murdered by the British. Now we have this concept of vampires that is so misleading that I'm certain that if there are vampires, wouldn't they take advantage of that? Wouldn't they love the average population to be that ignorant and believing in that kind of myth? And I hope that resonates with the audience.
Yeah, definitely. Now, another question coming from our chat room was, we were discussing about how, definitely Americans and Europeans at some point didn't bathe much, ate a lot of rancid meat.
Yeah.
We had a question come through in regards to that, saying, could it be a possibility that, through evolutionary habits of eating this rancid meat, that somehow, I guess, the vampire evolved?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's one of those evolutionary mysteries, like which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Right.
I seem to think that the rancid meat itself would not be a trigger for that. It would just seem to me to be like that was simply the diet that the Europeans had to grow used to by force, simply because there was no electricity for refrigeration. And because so much of Europe was always so cold, refrigeration was not necessarily all that big a deal. When you've had the mini ice age during the time of the Vikings and during the time in which you could just take a lot of meat outside and just let it sit in a separate shack, and it'd probably be safe to eat for several months, then you've got the situation where how would that be conducive to the evolution? But if we accept the evolutionary paradigm, it is something that is slow, and the diet itself might be conducive to that. It may not be. I think that maybe that caller might be. I'm just speculating here. He might be coming from a vegetarian's perspective. That maybe if we just stopped eating all this meat, we wouldn't have such bloodthirsty creatures walking amongst us. That's kind of where I get that from. But certainly, wouldn't it be so much easier to hide as a vampire in the modern world in this day of deodorants?
Right. Yeah. Nothing like a little axe, right?
That's right. That's right. Certainly I'm interested in what else your callers might come up with in terms of their also their historical questions, or what questions they might have concerning Vlad the Impaler specifically, and or vampirism in general from an Eastern European lore sense.
Well, you had mentioned about werewolves becoming vampires, and we did have someone who wanted you to kind of elaborate on that a little bit more.
It was there's not much that I can clarify beyond what I said, because we are talking about a medievalist paradigm. I mean, certainly, as I said, it was commonly accepted as fact that because of the idea of the warrior wolf, the term werewolf in German means like a war wolf or a weirding wolf, a changing wolf, and it comes from the Nordic berserker fury, where they would wear the skins of wolves or bears, and they felt that they could assume the shape and the spirit, the form of the wolf or the bear in battle through their berserk rage. And this is kind of shamanistic, a European tribal perspective, very much like a European form of aborigine or indigenous mentality. And that's why the werewolf resistance movement was organized at the end of the Third Reich. It meant that the entire population would hold resistance soldiers who would hide amongst the normal population but would come out at night to slaughter Allied or Soviet troops who were occupying Germany. That's where the werewolf resistance movement got its name, and the concept was that of the warrior Volk, or the Werwolfenvolk, or peoples, an entire people of resistance. And the Germans had gone through phases in history like this under the Romans, under the Prussians, under the Napoleonic Empire. So there was a very long tradition of the resistance population. But in terms of the medieval perspective, it was essentially believed that because the werewolf was a berserker who committed murder, as opposed to simply in combat, where he was simply killing, that he was a creature of damnation, and therefore when he died, his soul would know no rest, and it was automatically assumed that he would be a creature of perdition, and therefore the ground would not accept him, and that he would become a vampire or an undead being. It is important to remember there's no such legend as a vampire bat in Europe. All bats in Europe are fruit eaters. They do not subsist off blood. That is a New World phenomena, and that is strictly an American creation, a Gothic Victorian creation. Certainly one of the things in Bram Stoker's novel that stands out because of its incongruity is the character of a cowboy who does Dracula in at the end of the novel with a Bowie knife. And he's essentially thrown in there, and many critics can't understand why Bram Stoker even introduced him as a character into the novel. He seems to stand out so strangely as a character in the Gothic Victorian, but a lot of British critics have concluded that he's in there just to show how brutal and how crude Americans are, and that he's just too stupid to be scared. That's essentially what they feel his position in the novel is. But in terms of the bat, that is not a European symbol of vampirism. Rather, their belief was in that of the giant raven, that of an undead raven that fed off the corpses of people, and some of them would become like vultures or condemned in the sense that if they continued to feast off dead bodies in a battleground or in graves, if they developed a taste for human flesh, it was felt that some of these ravens would convert to a kind of vampiroid status, that was their version of a vampire bat. So a symbol of a vampire in the days of Dracula would be a huge black raven or a crow as opposed to a bat. I hope that that's coherent.
Yeah, it definitely is. Now, we do have a question from Bambi in the chat room in regards to Vlad, and that is, she's saying, he was known for impaling his enemies, and her question was, being that he was, among vampire slayers, that he was, due to his father, he continued that. Was any of these that he impaled, happen to be vampires?
Now that is an excellent question, and that is probably where he picked up the habit. That makes sense. That was through his original indoctrination, his original training as a crusader, not only against enemies foreign and domestic, but against enemies supernal or supernatural. And I think that what happened was later in life, he began to use that as a mass tactic of modern terror. To show how modern Dracula was, he was essentially he was what was known as the voyevode in Romania. And indeed, if you go into Serbia or Yugoslavia, you look at the northern half of the map. This would have to be on a very good map. Very few American maps are this detailed. But if you look at a detailed map of the Balkans, there is a region in Serbia named Vojvodina. That simply means military frontier region. And voyevode itself would be the Serbo-Romanian title that would be equivalent to the Japanese concept of shogun, the warrior prince of warlords. So that was the title that he assumed while he was alive. And as the voivode, he had essentially, it would convert into English as Generalissimo, Supreme High Barbarian Quelling Warlord. And in that position, he had the name of Vlad, which is really interesting because usually the Slavic or the Balkan name would be Vladislav, which means ruler of the Slavs, or Vladimir, which means ruler of the world. And the first ruler of Russia in Kievan Rus, his name was Vladimir, meaning ruler of the world. But Vlad's name is simply Vlad, meaning ruler. And this was very similar to a prototype of fascism because, say, for instance, in Germany, the ranks were Obergruppenführer, meaning overgroup leader, a kind of Standartenführer, standard leader. But when it got all the way up to Adolf Hitler, it was simply Führer. He was simply the leader. And with Vlad, his name just meant ruler. He was simply the ruler. And so he was known as Vlad III when he was alive, and he's known as Vlad IV after his resurrection and undeath. In his undeath, he's known as Vlad IV because he's disassociated from the Vlad who was the heir to his father, who is considered saintly. His father, Vlad Dracul, the original. This is important to explain because Wallachia was the core of Romania, was such a third world nation, like I said, the size of Connecticut. It had no knightly order of its own. It was too primitive. That's why they had to go to the Catholic Holy Roman Empire of the First Reich in order to get knighted. And so that knightly order was a Catholic knightly order. So these were like people of a different faith who were knighted in a different faith's knighthood in order to modernize their nation. And to show you the success of Dracula's modernization, he took that core of Wallachia, and by the time of World War II, when Romania sided with the Third Reich, Romania was the third largest nation in the European axis, the first largest being Germany, the second largest in population being Italy, and the third largest in population was Romania. And it was so huge in terms of population that they were the only ones to maintain normal-sized submarines in the Black Sea. Not the Third Reich, but Romania. The Italians operated midget submarines, but the Romanians had actual full-size submarines in the Black Sea. They also had their own Royal Romanian Air Force. That they also had a modern Panzer unit. So they were, at that point, an incredibly modern, huge nation by the time of the Second World War, and they looked upon their success and their independence as being thanks to Vlad the Impaler. I hope that makes historical sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely does. Now, Douglas, we're quickly getting to the end of the show here, and I want you to, I know you don't have a website personally, but I think you're working on one, but there is one that you're associated with that you definitely want people to check out, and if you could please give that out to everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, and with your discretion, sir, I'll also give out my email. And,
yes, you are more than welcome to, because you may get some questions for sure.
Fabulous. I want to emphasize the fact that I will be on Coast to Coast AM on November 11th on Veterans Day, and I'm trying to get my own website set up by that time, which would probably just be some Douglas Dietrich or the name of the website, just to make it easy for people to identify and reach. And because the subjects covered would be so immense, there's no real name I can give it other than just to name it after myself so that it can use various questions on it. But in terms of, because so many documents that I worked with, hopefully it's not due to some incipient megalomania, but we'll find out, right?
Right, yeah.
But in terms of the website that is my home now is thewormholes.org, and that would have to have the word "the" in front of it, then wormholes as a plural, and then .org, and I do believe that they've been able to download some footage of me, specifically addressing the zombie issue in terms of the Soviet Union, which hopefully with Mr. Greer's permission we can discuss sometime before Halloween as well as other subjects. And in terms of the wormholes.org, that will certainly be my home in cyberspace for now, but my means of contact will be with the current email address, which will be DouglasDietrich10 at yahoo.com, and Douglas is spelled with one S. Dietrich is spelled the way Marlene Dietrich used to spell her name. In other words, like Diet Rich. Just take the two words diet and rich, slam them together into Diet Rich, Dietrich. and put Douglas Dietrich, all one word, add the numbers 1 and 0, Douglas Dietrich 10 at yahoo.com. So that would be the email and the website. And I want to thank you so much for reminding me of that. I get so wrapped up in these topics, I forget everything. And I want to thank, of course, all the boys over at thewormholes.org for helping to make that possible for me to enter cyberspace a bit ahead of my time, so to speak, in that regard. Certainly it needs to be emphasized, and I'm sure this question will come up, I never worked with computers to any great extent while I was at the Department of Defense Library, because at that time the movie War Games was coming out, which glorified and glamorized a hacker. It became every hacker's right of initiation to break into whatever the Department of Defense put into cyberspace. So right. The DoD concluded that whatever they put into cyberspace, they were basically telling everybody. And the problem was, once it's in cyberspace, you can never really erase it. So everything that I worked with was hard copy and Rolodex, which was why I was never able to laterally transfer into a career as a civilian librarian. Libraries today are without walls, and the research done today is electronic research. And I'm old enough, having been born in 1966, as opposed to Mr. Greer, who's basically straight out of diapers and already a father, making me feel tremendously Asian. At any rate, he's a better man than I am. I can barely take care of myself. He's taking care of 5 sons, so I tip a hat to his level of responsibility and maturity. But yeah, I was never able to handle the computer. I'm still very cyberphobic, and hopefully I can adapt to that medium with the help of Mr. Greer, the audience, and other people who actually live in the 21st century. But hopefully I was able to help us understand a bit of past centuries and how important they were. The reason Dracula's world is so important to us is because we are rapidly returning to it. We are entering a new dark age, and this is an age in which a man's religion is once again what replaces politics as motivation. And I think we see enough of that around us to understand what I'm saying in that regard.
Yeah, I definitely believe so. Well, Douglas, I have to say it has been a very, very interesting show, and it was a pleasure having you on, and we definitely will love to have you back at some point in time.
Well, thank you, sir, and thanks so much for what you do for the community with your show and your magazine, Mysteries. I do hope to write an article that can be published in that magazine, hopefully with the next issue. When does it come out?
Our next issue goes to print in just a couple of weeks, actually.
Oh, so it might be the one after that.
Yeah, or one that we definitely fit into a theme. I know we, had spoke a little about maybe something on the vampires. Many people are very interested in, I think. Would make a great thing, but we'll definitely talk about that at some point in time. But again, Douglas, it was a pleasure having you on. We would definitely like to invite you back, and everyone in the chat room is wanting to say thank you, and they really enjoyed the show.
That's fabulous, and thanks to them as well. You're a beautiful group of people.
All right, Douglas, thank you very much, and we will talk with you later.
Thanks. I look forward to it.
All right, everyone, that was Douglas Dietrich on vampires. Very, very interesting stuff. A little bit scary, but great show. Really enjoyed having Douglas on. We want to thank him for coming, and especially thanks to all those who joined us tonight. Great turnout in the chat room. And, of course, our next show coming up this Sunday, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we are going to get back Dr. John Lerma. If you remember, we had some issues getting that show to happen. And I tell you what, it is going to happen this Sunday. At least I hope. Cross your fingers. So that is 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And, again, just a reminder to everyone, please send out your thoughts and prayers to Chad Austin's family in this time of need. It is a sad thing, and for those who maybe didn't catch it, a good friend of the paranormal community of Shadows in the Dark, a man I had the pleasure of meeting at some conferences and creating a friendship with, passed away this past Sunday unexpectedly in his sleep. He will be missed. He was young and leaves behind a wife and 2 young children. So please send your thoughts and prayers to his family. Well, everybody, we appreciate you tuning in tonight. This has been Shadows in the Dark, where the darkness is illuminated. Good night, everyone.
Shadows in the dark, 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 dark.